What if the person sitting quietly beside you on a train was the answer to a prayer neither of you had ever spoken out loud? The morning train leaving Chicago's Union Station rolled forward with a gentle hum, carrying strangers toward meetings, deadlines, family dinners, and dreams that refused to wait. Few passengers looked up from their phones. Even fewer noticed the tired man settling into seat 14C with a faded duffel bag at his feet and a little girl leaning sleepily against his shoulder. Ethan Walker smiled as he tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind 8-year-old Lily's ear before draping his old flannel jacket over her. It wasn't expensive, but it was warm, and that had always been enough. Across the aisle, a woman wearing a simple navy coat and a baseball cap lowered her eyes beneath the brim, hoping no one would recognize her. Claire Bennett had spent years appearing on magazine covers, speaking at shareholder meetings, and leading one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Yet this morning, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the rhythm of steel wheels gliding over tracks. She had canceled her private car, ignored the company jet, and bought a regular train ticket without telling anyone. Success had surrounded her with thousands of people, but loneliness had followed her into every room. The conductor called for tickets, voices blended into soft conversations, and sunlight spilled through the windows, painting golden streaks across worn carpet and polished armrests. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the aisle, while distant laughter echoed from the cafe car. It felt less like transportation and more like life pausing long enough for strangers to breathe. Lily slowly opened her eyes and looked toward Claire with innocent curiosity. "Daddy," she whispered, "that lady looks sad." Ethan glanced across the aisle for only a second before answering quietly. "Sometimes people carry things we can't see." Claire heard every word. She looked out the window, pretending to admire the passing fields, but something tightened gently inside her heart. No one had described her so honestly in years. Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out a homemade turkey sandwich cut neatly in half. Lily accepted her piece with a grin. "You always make the best lunches," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "That's because they're made with extra love and a little too much mustard." Lily giggled, the kind of carefree laugh that made nearby passengers smile without realizing it. Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd heard laughter that wasn't rehearsed for a camera or polished for a business dinner. She lowered her gaze again, suddenly aware of how quiet her own life had become. As the train crossed the Illinois countryside beneath a bright autumn sky, Ethan noticed Claire rubbing her temples with tired fingers. Without asking her name or wondering who she might be, he stood, walked toward the cafe car, and returned a few minutes later, holding an extra cup of hot tea. He stopped beside her seat and offered a gentle smile. "You look like you could use something warm," he said. Claire stared at the paper cup, then at the stranger whose kindness carried no expectation, no recognition, and no hidden agenda. She accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan simply nodded and returned to Lily as though nothing remarkable had happened. But somewhere between Chicago and the next quiet station, neither of them realized that one small act of grace had already begun changing two lives forever, and 3 months later, that same woman would stand on Ethan Walker's front porch carrying nothing but a small overnight bag and the courage to ask one impossible question. 3 months earlier, before anyone could have imagined where that quiet train ride would lead, Claire Bennett had become a woman trapped inside a life that looked perfect from the outside. Every weekday began before sunrise in a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago. Her calendar was filled from 7 in the morning until well after sunset with investor briefings, executive meetings, product launches, interviews, and endless decisions that affected thousands of employees. Every room applauded her confidence, but none of those rooms ever asked whether she was happy. She had spent 15 years building Bennett Digital Solutions into a company worth billions of dollars. Yet the higher she climbed, the fewer people spoke to Claire instead of speaking to her title. Assistants anticipated every need before she could voice it. Board members praised quarterly profits while quietly questioning every personal decision she made. Even family gatherings had slowly turned into conversations about market performance instead of memories. Her luxury penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows, but each evening the silence waiting behind its front door felt heavier than the city skyline outside. She often found herself eating dinner alone at a polished marble counter designed for entertaining a dozen guests. The expensive artwork on the walls impressed visitors, yet none of it offered comfort after another 14-hour workday. Friends had gradually become business partners. Dates had become networking opportunities. Every relationship seemed connected to influence, money, or public image. Claire sometimes wondered whether anyone remembered the young woman who once believed success meant creating something that improved people's lives instead of constantly protecting what she had already built. On that particular Friday morning, she canceled her private driver without explanation. She ignored 3 calls from her chief of staff, left her security detail behind, and slipped through Union Station wearing ordinary clothes that would not attract attention. She wanted one day that belonged to no one except herself. She wanted to hear ordinary conversations instead of corporate presentations. She wanted to remember what it felt like to exist without expectations pressing against every breath. As she waited on the platform, families embraced before departures, college students laughed over backpacks stuffed with textbooks, and elderly couples shared coffee from the same paper cup. The simple warmth between strangers stirred something inside her that years of achievement had never replaced. She boarded quietly, choosing a seat where no one seemed likely to recognize her. When she noticed Ethan helping Lily carefully place a small stuffed rabbit into the seat beside her before fastening her seat belt with patient hands, Claire looked away almost immediately, afraid she might be staring. Yet she could not ignore the calm that surrounded them. Ethan carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who expected nothing from the world except another chance to care for his daughter. There was no expensive watch on his wrist, no designer luggage by his feet, no polished speech meant to impress anyone. There was simply kindness woven into ordinary moments so naturally that he probably never realized how rare it had become. Watching him laugh with Lily over a crooked peanut butter cookie wrapped in wax paper reminded Claire of something she had almost forgotten. Wealth could purchase comfort. Influence could open doors. Recognition could fill newspapers. But none of those things could create the peaceful feeling she saw resting so effortlessly between a father and his little girl. And for the first time in many years, Claire silently wished she could borrow that kind of ordinary happiness, even if only for the length of a single train ride. The train settled into a steady rhythm as miles of amber fields and quiet towns drifted beyond the windows, and with every passing minute the invisible distance between 3 strangers became a little smaller. Lily swung her feet gently beneath her seat before turning toward Claire with the fearless curiosity that only children seem to possess. "Do you travel a lot?" she asked with a bright smile. Claire hesitated before answering. "Probably more than I should." Lily tilted her head. "Is it fun?" Claire looked out the window for a long moment. "Sometimes it is. Sometimes you forget where home is." Lily nodded thoughtfully as though she understood more than most adults ever would. "My daddy says home is wherever people are happy to see you." Ethan gave his daughter a gentle smile. "I also said that home is wherever somebody saves you the last cookie." Lily laughed and reached into her lunch bag before holding up one chocolate chip cookie wrapped carefully in a napkin. "He always saves one for me." Claire could not stop the small smile that appeared on her face. It felt unfamiliar, almost surprising. Ethan noticed, but chose not to mention it. He believed that kindness should never demand attention. Outside, patches of golden cornfields stretched toward the horizon, while weathered barns stood quietly beneath a brilliant blue sky. The afternoon sun warmed the train car, reflecting softly against polished windows and filling the cabin with a peaceful glow. Somewhere farther down the aisle, someone quietly strummed an acoustic guitar while another passenger hummed along, creating a melody so gentle that conversations naturally softened around it. Claire wrapped both hands around the paper cup of tea Ethan had given her earlier. It had cooled by now, yet she continued holding it because it reminded her that generosity still existed without contracts, publicity, or expectations. "Do you always carry extra tea?" she finally asked. Ethan chuckled softly. "Not usually, but I have learned that you never regret packing a little more than you think you need." Claire looked at him with genuine curiosity. "That sounds like experience talking." Ethan nodded once. "Being a parent teaches you that almost everything important begins with being prepared for someone else's needs before your own." Those words settled gently inside Claire's heart. She had spent years preparing presentations, negotiations, and expansion plans. Yet she could not remember the last time someone had spoken about caring for another person with such quiet certainty. Lily leaned closer to Claire. Daddy fixes houses, but I think he really fixes people. Ethan laughed in embarrassment. That is a pretty big promotion. Lily shrugged. You always make everybody feel better. Claire lowered her eyes, suddenly realizing that she already felt lighter than she had that morning. She had boarded the train hoping only to escape the noise of her own life for a few hours. Yet somehow a simple father and his daughter had already given her something no executive retreat or luxury vacation had managed to provide. They had reminded her what peace looked like when it lived inside ordinary moments. As the train speaker announced the next station, Claire quietly wondered whether this unexpected conversation would end when the doors opened, or whether fate had placed her beside Ethan Walker because both of them were standing at the edge of lives that were about to change forever. The train eased into the next station with a long, gentle sigh, and a handful of passengers gathered their bags before quietly stepping onto the platform. Fresh autumn air drifted through the open doors, carrying the scent of rain and roasted coffee from a nearby cafe before the conductor announced that they would remain stopped for 15 minutes. Lily looked up at Ethan with hopeful eyes. Can we stretch our legs? She asked. Ethan smiled. As long as we stay close. Claire watched them disappear onto the platform for a moment before looking down at her phone. The screen immediately filled with missed calls, unread emails, and urgent messages from executives asking where she was. She stared at them silently before pressing the power button and slipping the phone back into her coat pocket. For the first time in years, she chose silence over responsibility, at least for another few minutes. Outside, Lily skipped along the platform counting bright orange leaves that had gathered beside the tracks, while Ethan bought 2 hot chocolate drinks from a small vendor. As he turned back, he noticed Claire standing alone near the train doors, watching families greet one another with quiet smiles. Without making a fuss, he walked over and held out the extra cup. I guess tea might be cold by now, he said with an easy smile. Claire looked surprised. You really did not have to do that. Ethan shrugged gently. Kindness costs less than coffee. She accepted the cup and laughed softly, a laugh so natural that it almost startled her. You always know the right thing to say? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Not even close. I just try to say the honest thing. They stood together in comfortable silence while the afternoon breeze rustled the nearby maple trees. The golden sunlight reflected across the silver train cars, and somewhere farther down the platform a little boy chased pigeons while his grandmother laughed behind him. It was an ordinary scene, yet Claire realized she had not slowed down long enough to notice simple moments like these in years. Lily ran back, carrying a small red maple leaf. Look what I found. She handed it to Claire without hesitation. It is the prettiest one. Claire accepted it carefully, as though it were something priceless. Are you sure you do not want to keep it? Lily smiled. Daddy says beautiful things are even better when you share them. Claire glanced toward Ethan, who simply smiled without realizing how deeply those words had landed. The train whistle sounded in the distance, calling passengers back aboard. As everyone settled into their seats again, Claire quietly slipped the maple leaf inside the pages of the notebook she always carried for business ideas. Somehow that tiny leaf felt more valuable than many of the contracts she had signed. The journey continued beneath wide Midwestern skies painted with drifting white clouds, and conversations gradually returned to the gentle rhythm of travel. Ethan began telling Lily stories about restoring old farmhouses, explaining how every weathered piece of wood carried memories worth saving instead of replacing. Claire listened without interrupting, fascinated by the way he saw value in things others overlooked. She found herself wondering if people were the same. Perhaps broken hearts did not always need to be replaced. Perhaps they simply needed someone patient enough to restore them. Quietly, without asking anyone for permission, Claire made a decision that surprised even herself. Before this journey ended, she wanted to know more about the man who measured success not by what he owned, but by the peace he carried wherever he went. Late afternoon sunlight slowly faded into the warm colors of early evening as the train crossed another broad river, its reflection shimmering beneath the steel bridge before disappearing into rolling farmland. Inside the carriage, the conversations had grown quieter, replaced by the peaceful rhythm of wheels gliding across the rails. Lily had curled against Ethan's shoulder once again, hugging her stuffed rabbit while drifting into a light sleep. Ethan carefully adjusted the flannel jacket around her without waking her, his movements gentle, enough to make even nearby passengers smile. Claire watched in silence, realizing that real strength rarely announced itself. Sometimes it appeared in the smallest acts, like making sure a little girl stayed warm during a long journey. She found herself studying Ethan's weathered hands, hands marked by years of honest work, yet capable of remarkable tenderness. They were nothing like the polished handshakes she exchanged every day in boardrooms. Those hands built homes, carried groceries, packed school lunches, and comforted a child who trusted them completely. Somehow that seemed far more impressive than any business award hanging on the walls of her office. The conductor's voice echoed softly through the speakers, announcing that the next stop would be Ethan and Lily's destination. Ethan glanced out the window before quietly gathering their few belongings. There was no expensive luggage, only the faded duffel bag, Lily's small backpack, and the stuffed rabbit tucked carefully beneath her arm. Claire suddenly felt the weight of time slipping away faster than she wanted. She realized they had never exchanged last names. They had barely spoken about their lives. Yet she already knew this journey would remain with her long after it ended. As the train began slowing toward the station, Lily rubbed her eyes and smiled sleepily. "Are we home?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Almost." Lily looked at Claire. "I am glad you sat with us." Claire smiled warmly. "I am glad I did too." Ethan lifted the duffel bag over his shoulder before turning toward Claire. "I hope whatever you are traveling toward brings you some peace." Claire looked into his calm blue eyes for a moment that felt strangely longer than it really was. "I think it already has," she answered honestly. The train came to a gentle stop. The doors opened with a soft chime, and cool autumn air drifted inside. Ethan helped Lily down the steps before turning back one final time. Claire instinctively reached into her notebook and tore out a blank page, intending to write down her number, but hesitation stopped her hand. For years, people had approached her because of her influence, her wealth, or her position. Ethan had spoken to her simply because she was another human being who looked tired. She did not want that moment to change. Instead, she folded the blank paper back into the notebook and offered only a quiet smile. Ethan tipped his head politely, then disappeared into the small crowd with Lily walking beside him, their figures growing smaller beneath the golden station lights until they were finally out of sight. Claire remained seated long after the doors closed again, holding the pressed maple leaf inside her notebook as though it were a priceless keepsake. She whispered almost to herself, "Thank you." Then she looked out the window one last time, never imagining that the next time she would see Ethan Walker would not be on a train at all, but standing unexpectedly inside the headquarters of the very company she had spent her life building. 3 weeks passed, yet the quiet train ride refused to leave Claire's thoughts. Meetings continued, quarterly reports filled conference rooms, and reporters praised another successful acquisition. But in the quiet moments between conversations, she often found herself opening the notebook where the pressed maple leaf rested safely between 2 pages. It had become an unexpected reminder that genuine kindness asked for nothing in return. One crisp Monday morning, the lobby of Bennett Digital Solutions buzzed with employees carrying laptops, greeting coworkers, and hurrying toward elevators beneath soaring glass ceilings that reflected the bright autumn sunlight. Claire stepped through the front entrance surrounded by her executive team, but before anyone could begin discussing the day's agenda, her attention drifted toward a maintenance display near the reception desk. A local restoration company had been invited to evaluate original wooden beams that decorated the historic section of the headquarters before an upcoming renovation. Standing beside the display was a familiar man wearing a clean denim work shirt embroidered with the words Walker Restoration. Ethan studied the century-old oak paneling with quiet concentration while speaking respectfully with the building manager. He pointed toward a weathered section of wood and smiled. "Gently. You do not replace something because it has scars," he explained. "Sometimes you preserve it because those scars tell the story that gives it value." Claire stopped walking so suddenly that her assistants nearly continued without her. Ethan slowly turned after sensing movement behind him. Their eyes met across the polished marble floor, and for a brief moment the busy lobby seemed to fall completely silent. Surprise appeared first on his face, followed by recognition, then a warm smile that was exactly as calm as she remembered. It is you, Claire said softly before she could stop herself. Ethan laughed quietly. Looks like the train was not our last stop after all. The building manager looked from one to the other with visible curiosity. You two already know each other? Ethan answered simply. We shared a train ride. Claire nodded, choosing not to say anything more. She did not mention boardrooms, investors, or the company surrounding them. She simply extended her hand. It is good to see you again, Ethan. He shook it with the same steady kindness she remembered, completely unaware that every employee nearby had begun watching their normally reserved chief executive smiling more warmly than anyone had seen in years. Just then Lily stepped out from behind a stack of sample wood panels carrying a small sketchbook. Miss Claire, she exclaimed happily. Claire's eyes brightened immediately. Lily, I cannot believe you remember me. Lily grinned. Daddy says you should always remember people who make your heart feel peaceful. Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion. Before she could answer, one of her senior executives approached carrying a tablet. Good morning, Miss Bennett. The board meeting begins in 10 minutes. Ethan blinked in surprise. He looked from the executive back to Claire. Miss Bennett. The executive smiled politely. Our chief executive officer. Ethan's expression changed, not with fear or admiration, but with quiet understanding. Suddenly, the unanswered phone calls, the thoughtful silence, and the ordinary clothes on the train all made sense. Claire searched his face, hoping nothing essential had changed between them. Ethan smiled just as gently as before and said, I guess titles really do have a way of hiding the person underneath them. Those simple words settled into Claire's heart far more deeply than any compliment she had received in years. The elevator doors closed behind Claire, but her thoughts never reached the executive floor. Throughout the board meeting, she heard presentations about revenue forecasts, international expansion, and shareholder expectations. Yet every polished slide seemed strangely distant compared to one simple sentence spoken downstairs. Titles really do have a way of hiding the person underneath them. Those words lingered in her mind long after the meeting ended. Late that afternoon, she surprised her assistant with an unusual request. Please ask Mr. Ethan Walker to stay for a few minutes after his consultation. I would like to thank him personally. The assistant blinked with mild surprise before quietly nodding. Half an hour later, Ethan stood in a sunlit conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline, turning a small sample of reclaimed oak in his hands while waiting patiently. When Claire entered carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee, he smiled exactly as he had on the train. I was beginning to think chief executive officers were too busy for old carpenters, he said with an easy laugh. Claire handed him a cup. Today I would rather just be Claire. They sat across from one another without conference notes, contracts, or presentations between them. The room that usually hosted multi-million-dollar negotiations felt unexpectedly peaceful. Claire asked about Lily's school, his restoration business, and the century-old farmhouse he was renovating outside the city. Ethan answered each question with the quiet pride of someone who loved honest work. When he spoke about restoring old homes, his eyes carried the same warmth she had seen when he looked after Lily. Every building deserves someone willing to see what it can become, he said. Most people only notice what is broken. Claire lowered her coffee cup slowly. People are probably the same. Ethan nodded gently. I think so. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon sun painted long, golden lines across the hardwood floor while the distant sound of city traffic faded beneath the quiet hum of the building. Claire realized she had not enjoyed a conversation this simple in years. Just then her office door opened softly. 2 senior board members stepped inside, stopping almost immediately when they noticed Ethan. One exchanged a polite smile, while the other looked briefly toward Claire with visible curiosity. We apologize for interrupting, one of them said. We wanted to review tomorrow's investor dinner. Claire stood calmly. It can wait 10 minutes. The 2 executives exchanged another glance before quietly leaving the room. Ethan noticed the subtle tension, but simply smiled. I probably just delayed something important. Claire shook her head. You reminded me what important actually feels like. Ethan looked out the window toward the busy streets below where hundreds of people hurried through another workday. It must be difficult carrying responsibility for so many people. Claire answered honestly. Sometimes it feels like everyone knows my name, but almost nobody knows me. Ethan considered that quietly before replying. Maybe that is because they keep looking up at your office instead of sitting beside you. Claire laughed softly, and for the first time in a very long while it came without effort. As Ethan gathered his notebook to leave, Claire walked him toward the lobby. Several employees watched with quiet surprise as their usually reserved chief executive officer personally thanked a local craftsman at the front entrance. Ethan tipped his hat politely before stepping outside into the cool autumn air. Claire remained standing behind the glass doors, watching him cross the sidewalk with the same calm confidence that had first caught her attention on the train. Deep inside, she recognized a truth she could no longer ignore. Success had built the life she owned, but this quiet man had begun teaching her how to truly live inside it. Over the following weeks, an unexpected rhythm quietly formed between their very different lives. Claire found reasons to visit restoration projects that Bennett Digital Solutions sponsored throughout the city, and somehow Ethan always seemed to be working on one of them. Sometimes she arrived carrying coffee for everyone on the crew. Other times, she simply stood nearby listening as Ethan explained how old wood could remain strong if someone took the time to understand its history instead of hiding its imperfections. Those conversations slowly became the favorite part of her week. On Saturday mornings, when business calendars remained blissfully empty, Claire accepted Ethan's invitation to visit the farmhouse he was restoring outside the city. Lily immediately appointed Claire as her official painting assistant, even though most of the paint somehow ended up on old work gloves instead of the wooden fence. Their laughter echoed across the quiet property while crisp autumn air carried the scent of fresh cedar and fallen leaves. Ethan watched from the porch with a gentle smile, grateful that his daughter had found someone who listened to every story with genuine attention. Claire, who had spent years surrounded by polished conference tables and glowing computer screens, found herself discovering joy in ordinary moments she had almost forgotten existed. They shared homemade sandwiches beneath a towering maple tree, drank hot apple cider from simple mugs, and ended long afternoons watching the sun settle behind distant fields painted gold. Lily often slipped her small hand into Claire's without thinking, as though kindness had already introduced them long before names ever had. One evening, while the three of them carved pumpkins for the coming harvest festival, Lily looked up with complete innocence and asked, "Miss Claire, do you think families can grow even when they do not start together?" The question settled softly into the cool evening air. Claire looked toward Ethan before smiling warmly at Lily. "I think families grow wherever people choose to love, respect, and care for one another." Lily nodded happily as though that answer made perfect sense. Ethan quietly lowered his eyes, knowing those words carried more meaning than either of them was ready to speak aloud. Yet outside their peaceful weekends, another world continued moving without mercy. Rumors quietly spread through the executive offices after several employees noticed the chief executive officer spending increasing amounts of time with a local craftsman. A few board members questioned whether personal relationships might distract from corporate leadership. Investors politely suggested that public appearances should remain carefully managed. One longtime advisor even remarked that someone with Claire's position should be more mindful of how easily ordinary friendships could become headlines. Claire listened respectfully, but offered no explanation. For the first time in many years, she realized she no longer wanted every decision measured by public approval. She wanted at least one part of her life to belong only to her heart. Ethan noticed the growing attention as well. During one visit to the farmhouse, he quietly folded away a newspaper, carrying a photograph of Claire leaving a community restoration event beside him. He smiled gently so Lily would not worry, but later that evening, after she had gone inside, he stood alone on the porch watching the stars emerge above the fields. He understood that Claire carried responsibilities far greater than his own, and he silently wondered whether the peaceful life they were slowly building together might someday become the very burden she would be forced to leave behind. The first snow of December settled quietly across northern Illinois, covering rooftops, empty fields, and the weathered porch of Ethan's farmhouse in a blanket of white that softened every familiar corner. Inside, the smell of cinnamon, pine, and fresh bread filled the house while Lily carefully hung handmade ornaments on a Christmas tree that leaned ever so slightly to one side. Ethan smiled as he adjusted the crooked star at the top. "Perfect," he said. Lily laughed. "It is only perfect because it is ours." Those simple words lingered in the room just as a familiar car pulled slowly into the driveway. Claire stepped outside wearing a warm wool coat, carrying nothing more than a small overnight bag and the notebook that had traveled with her ever since that unforgettable train ride. She paused for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene before walking toward the porch. Ethan opened the door before she had the chance to knock. Neither of them rushed to speak. Some moments were too meaningful to interrupt with unnecessary words. Finally, Claire smiled. "I needed somewhere that felt like home." Ethan answered with the same quiet warmth she had carried in her heart since the day they met. "Then you came to the right place." Lily hurried forward and wrapped her arms around Claire without hesitation. "We saved you a stocking," she announced proudly. Claire looked toward the fireplace where 3 stockings now hung side by side. Her eyes filled with grateful tears that she did not try to hide. Weeks earlier, she had made one of the most difficult decisions of her career. She remained chief executive officer, but she restructured her responsibilities, trusted the leadership team she had spent years building, and refused to allow endless meetings to replace the life she finally understood was worth living. Some people questioned her choices. Others quietly admired them. Claire no longer measured success by either opinion. She measured it by whether she could sit beside people she loved without looking at the clock. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, the 3 of them boarded a familiar evening train for a short holiday ride through the countryside, simply because Lily thought trains looked magical beneath winter lights. They found seats beside the window as snowflakes drifted gently across the dark landscape. Families talked quietly around them while children pointed excitedly at decorated towns passing outside. Claire reached into her notebook and carefully unfolded the pressed maple leaf that had remained hidden between its pages for months. Though its bright color had faded, its meaning had only grown stronger. She placed it gently into Ethan's hand. "I carried this because I never wanted to forget the day someone treated me like an ordinary person." Ethan looked at the fragile leaf before smiling. "You were always extraordinary. You just needed someone who could see Claire before seeing everything else." Lily leaned comfortably against them both, slowly falling asleep as the train rolled peacefully through the snowy night. Ethan wrapped an arm around his daughter while Claire rested her head gently against his shoulder. Outside, the rails stretched endlessly toward the horizon, glowing beneath the moonlight like quiet promises waiting to be fulfilled. The journey that had begun with strangers sharing a seat had never really been about reaching another station. It had been about discovering that dignity often speaks in whispers, that second chances arrive when hearts remain open, and that the greatest miracles rarely begin with wealth, power, or perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with one kind stranger, one shared cup of tea, one little girl who believed beautiful things should always be shared, and one ordinary train ride that gently carried 3 lonely hearts home. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.